welcome to the BL Business Branding Podcast. This is your host, Nick Martinez, here with my co-host, Isabel Wadsworth. Today we're going to be talking about the Shelby Mustang deemed Eleanor from the hit movie Gone in 60 Seconds. So here we've had a bit of a legal battle going on for almost 2 decades now.
Right. Yes, it's definitely a long one, and it involves the iconic Mustang that you mentioned, known as Eleanor, from the movie Gone in 60 Seconds. And it's a lawsuit that touches on everything from copyright to intellectual property to some iconic movie history. So, not to be punny, but let's buckle up and take a ride and talk about this case. It's a really interesting one.
Yeah, so my understanding here is there was kind of a dispute between Shelby Mustangs and their licensed workshops that will go ahead and produce models, different trim models for Mustang cars.
Yes.
Which is, of course, a subset of Ford. But they were modeling them after Eleanor, which was, of course, featured in Gone in 60 Seconds. And up here on the screen, you can see it's a nice-looking car. It's something that, they wanted to be able to go ahead and profit off of.
Yeah.
But then the rights to the movie were, from my understanding, trying to restrict that, trying to say, no, this is a character in our movie that we have copyright protections for.
Exactly. You touched on it right there. So the core question, as you just mentioned, is does the Mustang Eleanor, as you see on the screen, qualify as a character that's eligible for copyright protection, which is a type of IP protection that we've talked about before on the show. And you might be wondering, or listeners might be wondering, how can a car be a character? Like, how can something that isn't alive be a character? And this isn't just about whether, a cool muscle car gets, a specific type of protection. It's about whether, Eleanor has the kind of qualities that would make her copyright eligible. And the answer isn't really super cut and dry. It's not super simple. And to get to the heart of this, we have to look back. I know you're going to touch on the settlement agreement and everything, but it really does go back to what are the specific characteristics of this thing, even though we know it's a car, that could make it copyright eligible.
Yeah, certainly. And I think if we kind of look at the spectrum of cars in movies, you probably go to just a car that was in the background to maybe the Fast and Furious franchise, to Lightning McQueen, right? Where clearly Lightning McQueen would be a character.
Yes.
Where if it's kind of just a vehicle the characters are in, that turns into it's just a prop, right? It's not necessarily a character.
Yes. The first thing that comes to mind to me is the Batmobile. The Batmobile, to me, in my opinion, is very much a character. People identify it as a character. And I think it is a character. That's, just one example, but there are several. You just mentioned, Lightning McQueen, the Transformers franchise, for example. So it is an interesting question that comes across a lot, especially in action movies like this one. But I want to talk about for a second the settlement agreement from 2009, because that really plays a part here. So in 2009, a settlement agreement was reached between Haliki, I think that's how you pronounce her last name, the widow of the creator, Eleanor, and Carroll Shelby Licensing, which you mentioned earlier. And in 2009, there was a dispute about, Shelby's alleged infringement of Haliki's claimed copyright interest in Eleanor. And under the settlement, Shelby, which was, as you mentioned, the custom car shop, was forbidden from producing the GT 500E Ford Mustangs with Eleanor's distinctive hood, which, again, you were saying, it's a cool-looking car. People kind of wanted that look, so that's why they entered into this settlement agreement. However, right after the settlement, Shelby licensed a company called Classic Recreations, and they produced another version of the Mustang known as the GT 500 CR. And for those of you listening who are Mustang fans, you'll know exactly what that car is. And Haliki argued that violated the settlement. I mentioned that just to kind of highlight the underpinnings of all of this. In this case, it was in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, but there's a lot of backstory here that feeds into this analysis, and I think it is really interesting to see it develop through the Ninth Circuit.
Certainly, and I think that can go into a lesson there of sometimes settlement agreements can be drafted a little too narrow, right? Because I believe that was one of the Ninth Circuit's ultimate deciding factors of this case was that the settlement agreement did not specifically address this situation.
Right.
So they had to lean back onto, I believe they followed a three-part test to kind of decide whether or not Eleanor was a character.
Right. It's and this Ninth Circuit case with the test you're referring to, I think it's the towel test. It was laid out, I think, really well in this case, and it has been laid out before in DC Comics and in certain cases involving the Batmobile. And you mentioned that three main criteria, and it's really boiled down to the physical and conceptual qualities of the thing that the court is analyzing. In this case, it would be a car. What are the identifiable traits? Is there consistency? Is there distinctive expression? Does it look more than like what a generic car would look like? These are some of the things that the court was looking at. That's a very high level view of the towel test, but that's basically the highlight. So the court looked at how Eleanor stacks up against this test. And they looked at, I mentioned distinctive expression. They looked at the identifiable traits, the physical and conceptual qualities, the audience's perception of the character, and it's really interesting to see how they came out on it.
Certainly, because I think if you compare, the Batmobile is a great comparison here.
Right.
Where the Batmobile, you can't go around and just buy a Batmobile at a dealership, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Eleanor, at the end of the day, was a Mustang. It was a cool-looking Mustang,
right?
But it was still a Mustang with mostly stock parts. It didn't have any supernatural or above what you could expect performance qualities, right? This wasn't a speed racer situation,
right?
It was more or less a car that Nick Cage really wanted.
Yes, that's very true. And also Speed Racer is a great movie. Love that movie. Love the cars in those movies. But so when the court ruled that, at the end of the day, they said, look, as you were just saying, Eleanor is definitely iconic and memorable. She, was more of a generic muscle car. And just sort of another stock action movie vehicle. She didn't have any unique or creative expression that would set her apart as a character in the way that something like Herbie the Love Bug or, the Batmobile would have. And it's a big decision, and it's, I think the court really, really took to heart all of the different past examples of this as well. There's definitely some nods to some other cases that involve cars like this, and it's always cool to see these things play out, especially in the entertainment industry. So
certainly, and as we said, this case has been going on almost 2 decades. It's gone through the Ninth Circuit, but there could always be an appeal.
Right. Totally. Yeah. There could always be an appeal. I think that this definitely adds to a larger conversation about how, folks in the entertainment industry can protect their rights over certain props, over certain characters, especially in the big action movies. So it's definitely interesting. Obviously, we're going to be tracking this case. I think it's really cool, and we'll see if it gets appealed. So.
Certainly.
Yes.
And as Isabel said, we're definitely going to keep our eye on this matter and other interesting intellectual property developments in the entertainment industry.
Yes.
And we'll keep you updated.